Let's do some printmaking with supplies that our students hopefully have on hand at their homes, namely styrofoam and cardboard boxes. I'll be using a box from an old snack container. Most of our students, I'm assuming, are going to have snack boxes, cereal boxes, and those kind of things. When you're doing this project, the really good real estate, the high value cardboard, we'll call it, are the two big flat pieces. One of those large flat pieces can be used as the base or the surface for creating our print, and the other piece could be used for cutting out shapes for our print. Now, I'm going to be doing a landscape, two different kinds of landscapes with my cardboard, but you could do that same thing with me, or you could be thinking about a favorite lesson of yours that you want to introduce this printmaking technique with. It's so versatile. I have done lots of different things from robots to spaceships, landscapes like this with this coleograph method. By the way, I guess I should have mentioned it. That's the name of this printmaking technique. When I do this with my students in the classroom, I have them spend a day just kind of cutting out their shapes. One thing I've noticed when I do this activity with students is that oftentimes they will cut and glue as they go. And when they do that, they tend to peter out a lot faster. They will say, yeah, that looks good enough to me, even if their building has like one window and no way of getting in, no door. So I always have my students do this. We just sit and cut the cardboard, making large sizes, medium shapes, and small, cutting a variety from rectangles and circles to squares and triangles. Once they have a good solid amount of cardboard cut, if we're in the classroom, we keep that cardboard in an envelope with their name on it. That way we can keep up with all those little bits and pieces. One of the great things about this project is you can really focus a lot on composition. Once your students have all of their pieces cut out, then they can take that time to start rearranging where they want things to go. Doing this virtually, you could do the same thing. Make sure that they spend a lot of time focused on cutting out those shapes before anchoring them down with glue. Okay, glue. If your students don't have glue at home, you could easily do this with a glue stick. Tape could even work in a pinch. Once they have things kind of tacked down and glued down, then it's important to let it dry, especially if you're using white glue like me, as it tends to kind of, take a minute or two to stick. This project for me is kind of like the gift that keeps on giving, because you can do a rubbing with a coleograph, you can do a print with a coleograph, and then you can use the printing plate itself as a work of art. So that's 3 different projects for the price of one. That's better than a BOGO, y'all. So I really love doing this with my students, and it's something that they can continue to add to and work on. The reason I like to do a coleograph before pulling a print with this is because if the kids take a rubbing from their printing plate, they can see, oh, I don't really have much detail here. I could probably go back and add more there. So it's almost as if doing the texture rubbing is a little bit of a test to kind of see where it's at. It's difficult for kids to understand the concept of what this coleograph is going to look like or exactly what the end result is going to be unless they do something like a texture rubbing. So I'm just finishing up mine, adding final details. And like I said, you could join me in doing a landscape, or you could come up with one of your favorite artists or a project that you would like to focus on and have that be your theme for your coleograph, or throw it out there to your kids, right? Ask them something that they would like to create their print with. I have noticed that it works really well if you're going to focus on a project that has more geometric shapes. But in a moment, I will show you something, a landscape where it's focused more on organic shapes. All right, now that I have almost everything glued down, I'm almost ready to do a rubbing. When I do my texture rubbing for this coleograph, I'm using crayons where I've removed all of the paper. By the way, there is an that's like the first thing I do when I get a box of crayons or oil pastels for that matter is take all my crayons, throw them in some soapy water and just let them soak overnight. It won't hurt the crayons or the oil pastels at all, but it'll make it so that the next day you can just easily slide the paper wrapper off of all of those oil pastels and crayons. Personally, I'd rather do it that way as opposed to me having to peel them off and getting oil pastel nails, which I can't stand. Gosh, it's like cringy just thinking about it. Okay, so I'm working on the other landscape. One of the great things about doing this method for doing a landscape is the torn papers can become your background, your middle ground, and your foreground. So now you can see a big difference between the cut shapes and the torn shapes. The torn shape really adds, I feel like, a really cool organic look to that landscape. Again, when you're using the glue, it's so funny. I'm sitting here using a glue bottle, and my students in my room, we do not use glue bottles. I hate glue bottles. There's not a whole lot of things that I reserve the word hate for, but glue bottles is definitely one of them. I can't stand clogging, refilling them, you name it. There's no love there. In my art room, if I were doing this with my students would be using a little condiment cup with a little tiny dollar store glue paintbrush that we use as a glue brush. And they simply paint the white glue on the back of whatever it is they're working on. We always put glue around the edges, never ever putting glue in the middle, because you guys know they'll just put a little dot of glue in the middle and then nothing sticks and you got these like flyaway edges. So in my room, that's just something that we do. It's one way that I have managed to get away from using the glue bottle and keeping my sanity. I only put about 1/4 of an inch of glue in my glue cups, probably every 3 days or so. And after every art class at the end of every art class, we take those glue brushes and we put them in a little container that I call the paintbrush hot tub. And it's just a little container filled with soapy water for me to soak those sticky glue brushes. All right, so I'm almost done working on kind of like, I guess, my organic version of this landscape. Now that I'm finished, I am now ready to do that rubbing. So what I noticed when I was doing my rubbings with this project is that I really prefer the construction paper crayons for everything. Like, I kind of don't know that regular crayons need to be hanging around anymore, because what you're going to see when I do the rubbing is that the color is a lot more rich when it comes to using those construction paper crayons. I'm a big fan. They don't have the huge variety of color that other crayons do, but I do love that they have a lot more, I guess we'll call it opacity. They're a lot less waxy. All right, so I'm going to cut out just a little roof for my house before we get to adding all the, doing that texture rubbing. When doing a rubbing, it's really important that your students anchor their paper down nice and firmly with one hand. Now, you can go about doing a rubbing 2 ways. My usual way of doing it is to tell my students that they have to lay their crayon down like it's sleeping, and then they do that rubbing that way, making sure to rub the crayon across the paper. Now, there's so many different things you can kind of do with this that you could shift the paper a little bit, move it just slightly, and do another rubbing. That would be really cool, especially if you were doing a coleograph of figures, and then the figures could kind of take on that look as though they were moving. Something else you can do is, instead of holding the crayon like it's sleeping, you can hold the crayon like a pencil and color it that way. This offers a lot more of a richer kind of look. I also love doing this with overlapping different colors of crayons. So definitely something to give it a shot. You could also do a light wash with watercolor over these, but since you're probably going to be working with kids at home who might not have access to watercolor, I'm going to show you an alternative to that. So this is just round 1 of what you can do with your coleograph. Next up after this, we're going to be printing, and then we're going to be using that plate for our work of art. So this is one of my favorite hacks for allowing our students to paint if they are at home and they don't have access to it. As long as they've got water-based markers. They don't even have to be water-based markers that are still working. They can be water-based markers that are running out of juice. All they have to do is outline whatever it is that you want them to paint. So I'm going to be outlining my skyline here with a little bit of my water-based marker. I'm using a praying marker. Just a regular old coloring marker, anything that is not a permanent marker or a Sharpie. Speaking of markers, by the way, if ever you are marker shopping, as one does, hello, you're an art teacher, so of course you're going to be doing that. I always prefer to get the ones that are not washable. I've noticed basically, and this is just me throwing this out there, my little soapbox rant, anything that happens to say washable on it, whether it's tempera paint or markers, they tend to not be as great as the ones that don't say washable. I mean, it's definitely going to be an issue when somebody's angry mama gives you a call, but just show them how beautiful and brilliant and bright the artwork is, and just cross your fingers that makes everything better. All right, now that I've got this colored in, I wanted to go ahead and add a little bit of a wax resist, and my hope was that this would look kind of like a Vincent van Gogh-esque sky. Yeah, you're going to see in a moment that it didn't quite turn out that way, but the beauty of these crayon rubbings is that you can just keep doing it again and again. If your kids make one, they can experiment with it. If they don't like it, it's fine. Just make another one. That's one of the other things I love about printing. It's the gift that keeps on giving. When you do this marker trick, by the way, it feels as though, or it looks as though, that the water is not quite waking up the marker. So what you're doing is you're taking your paintbrush and you're dipping it or kind of rubbing it over where you put the marker. It then kind of works as a watercolor paint pan. The longer that it sits, even after you've painted it, I've noticed that the color from the marker tends to continue to bleed out. If the paper is damp, you can even go back and add a little sprinkle of salt, just like you would do with a regular watercolor paint project. And of course, your students could do that at home, assuming that they have salt, which, I mean, they do. So here I am just trying out how this one would look. I think they look really fabulous. And I'm going to also test this out with the markers as well as that rainbow assortment of coloring with my crayons. I don't know why. I just love doing these rubbings. I think what would be fun for students, especially in class, they could swap these. They could try out rubbing their neighbor's artwork. They could even offer up a constructive criticism to say, hey, there's not much in this landscape or in this portrait or in this rocket ship that you made. You might want to add something here. You might want to add something there. I don't know. I haven't had to teach my students virtually this year. I did it a lot in the spring. It might even be interesting to have them create these on a small scale. You can see here mine is pretty small. Could they then turn these into some sort of postcard that they could send to one another or family members? All right, so now I'm going to use the same trick that I used just a moment ago to add a little bit of a watercolor look to this sunset. When you do this, it's important that your students know that they should probably use colors that are more analogous, same side of the color wheel, because that way when the colors get wet and they mix together, they blend together nicely as they would in a sunset sky. Something you might want to consider doing once you're either back in school or if your students are able to bring their finished works of art to school to share with you is to showcase this project as a process. A lot of times when teachers, faculty, staff, and other students see finished works of art hanging in the halls of school, they don't understand the learning that went into that creating. So when this project is finished, your students are going to have a mountain of rubbings like we just did here. They'll have several different kinds of prints or several different prints, and then they'll also have their printing plate, which, like I said, is going to be a work of art. Why not frame all three of those together and then kind of allow that to share the story of how the artwork was created? Once the texture rubbings are made, then you can cover your printing plate with aluminum foil. Dollar Tree sells packs of pre-cut, which I love that it's pre-cut, aluminum foil. I think it's like 30 sheets for $1, which is fabulous. And then have your students use just their fingertips. That's important because you don't want their nails to slice into the foil, to massage that little printing plate of theirs to reveal their design underneath. This is going to now become our surface for printing with markers. So I am just kind of making sure I can still see my buildings well enough to start coloring over them with water-based markers. So I'm using these, and I'm just using a variety of color, and I'm going to be filling it all the way in so that I can pull a print. Now, when I'm doing this in class with my students, I have 30-minute classes. So sometimes my students will start coloring this plate and then not have time to print it. It does not have to be wet. The marker does not have to be wet in order for the print to turn out well. Meaning they could color on it and then save it until next week and then continue coloring on it the following art class. It's kind of crazy because as the marker starts to dry, it fades considerably. It looks like some places it's even disappeared. Don't worry. Trust me when I say I've had that little bit of like, uh-oh, we're going to have to redo this. And then when we pull the print, it's perfect. It works just fine. So don't sweat it, and just make sure that as they're coloring, they're using a variety of different colors. And again, I'm using those I keep calling them washable markers, but they're the ones that aren't permanent. Okay, so coloring markers. Once you've gotten a variety of that finished, then you'll be ready to have your students print. So for this kind of printing, especially for your kids who are working at home, they'll be needing to print on a kind of paper that's probably a little thicker if you can manage than copy paper, because we're about to get our piece of paper dampened with a sponge and then printing on top of that. So if your students have a sketchbook paper or something that's a little bit thicker, that would be great. And this is a lot like the coleograph, and this is the same with all printing. You can make as many prints from this as your cute little heart desires, and you can experiment with it too. You don't have to color things in completely. I could totally leave the starry night sky looking just like that before pulling a print. You can go back and add more lines and designs and details. It's pretty cool how it will turn out, but there is a little bit of troubleshooting. So in a moment, I'm going to be dampening a piece of paper with a sponge and then laying that paper on top of my foil to pull the print. If you don't use enough water, then the water, which is what activates that marker, kind of quote, brings it back to life again, then there's not enough of that water to make the color nice and saturated. And if you use too much water, which is what I accidentally end up doing, if you use too much, then it almost looks like I guess it just is too wet looking and it gets a little bit faded. Some of the details can get lost. For me, it's all about the process of it, so it's totally fine. And allowing your students to know you can always do another one, it's okay. That's just something important we need to instill in our students anyway. Learn from it. Don't get upset by it. You can be disappointed all you want. Life is filled with disappointments, but you have to learn from the mistake. So I tell my students, okay, so if you're not happy with it, think about what you're not happy with. Was it too wet? Did it not have enough water? How can you then fix that? So the next time, hopefully, you'll be happier with it. So we try to really hard learn from our mistakes the best we can. And the cool thing is that once you have printed a bunch of these, and if you're doing this in the classroom or even via Zoom, your early finishers, they can color it again, pull another print. Just try it again. Let's see what it looks like with just one color. What if you color it in a variety of different ways? What if you give it a daytime sky, even though you put a moon in there? That allows your kids to keep experimenting and share other ideas with one another, bouncing ideas off of each other. Once their artwork has dried after they've pulled the print, then they can even go back and add more details with a permanent marker on top. All right, I'm going to zip ahead, get this finished coloring so we can pull that print. I did go back and add a little bit more detail because honestly, I just couldn't help myself. So just adding some window panes, some lines to the roof line, even a doorknob before taking the time to pull that print. Okay, so when you're pulling that print, I'm using a little sponge with a handle on it. Your kids could use a regular sponge. I have a friend who's even done this with a baby wipe. Make sure that you just dampen the paper enough that there is a slight sheen to it. You know what? The thing is, you just got to try it. You're going to see, oh, this is what it looks like with too much water. Oh, this is what it looks like with not enough. I think it's a little bit better to aim on the side of too much water because not enough, you're not going to get any kind of result. You can also do this trick with styrofoam, which is what we're going to be doing shortly. All right, let's check it out. You can already see my design starting to come through. And now for the big reveal, let's see how this looks. Drum roll, please. Here we go. All right. So yeah, you see what I was talking about. Maybe just a pinch too much water. Let's try it again. This time I'm going to speed it up. And like I said, those early finishers, they could just keep going. I know that that's got to be super tricky when you're teaching via Zoom, where you have those kids who do literally Zoom through their projects. So a good way to keep them interested and engaged is to have them to continue printing. So I'm just going to add more color, try to learn from my mistakes, and maybe not add so much water this time. Let's check and see how this print turns out. All right, moment of truth. I'm going to try not to add as much water this time. So check out, though, how different that marker print looks from that texture rubbing that I did not too long ago. Drastically different results from the very same texture plate. That will be pretty cool when you share those in the hallway so people can really see how this whole process of printing these coleographs go about. Okay, let's check out how this one goes, and fingers crossed. Okay. Now what I'm doing is I'm going to go back. This is my final phase of this project. A lot of times your students, if they're like mine, they are dying to take their printing plates home, but then they don't really do much with them once they've got them home. They always have these grand notions of wanting to print with them, but then they never really do. So instead of just having them take the printing plate home, why not turn the printing plate into a final work of art itself? I love coloring over foil with Sharpies because it gives that really beautiful metallic kind of look when the foil shines through. So that's just what we're doing here. Any kind of permanent marker will work. By the way, you can definitely do this project with printing ink. In fact, I know most of you probably have. So if and when you are back in the classroom, instead of just skipping over that step, before covering with cardboard, go ahead and get out the brayers, get out the printing ink, and while it's covered in cardboard, roll the ink on the cardboard, press a piece of paper on top, and pull a print. That means you could technically get 4 different projects out of this one. So it's not like a 3-for-1, it's a 4-for-1. How amazing is that? And of course, these would be beautiful all framed together. Oh, and if the kids are printing, why not have a print swap? That's another favorite thing that my kids love to do is we lay all of our prints out. We pick our favorite prints that we're going to display in the hallway, and then we swap with one of our neighbors or put them all together in some sort of book that we can contribute to the classroom teacher or to our class to make kind of like a class book of prints. Especially fun if the kids are doing things like portraits or buildings from the town. You name it, possibilities are endless. Okay, so I'm almost done working on using Sharpie marker, and this will be the final frontier for this project. Next up, we're going to be using a styrofoam plate. That's what I happen to have on hand. Your students and you could use whatever kind of styrofoam you can get your cute little kitten mittens on. That will do the trick. A takeout container, a styrofoam plate, anything will work. And I also mentioned having 2 different color ink pens on hand. That's just me being a little bit nitpicky, and I'll share why shortly. If your students are doing this at home, then they could just use 1 ink pen is totally fine if they don't have to, because in this demonstration, I could only find a black pen. So I will only be using 1 color, but I'll share the method behind that madness in just a moment. Okay, nearly finished. Now let's just take a look at all of the things that we made. And I want to share with you some of the things that I did based on these ideas this summer. All right, looking pretty good. So this summer, I did the same kind of concept with spaceships, rocket ships. I couldn't think of it for a second. And you can see the difference in my printing, what a little bit less water looks like. I also did robots, which was a big hit with my students. And then here is one of those collagraph prints with the marker watercolor trick. All right, guys, let's grab some styrofoam, and you'll see I'm recycling an old plate from my classroom. And I always start off having my students or me cutting off the rim of the plate. So trim that off, maybe set it aside for something else later. If your students, by the way, don't have cardboard, or you decide not to do that kind of project that we did earlier, you could do the same kind of technique with styrofoam. You could have them cut out shapes and use that as their base, just like we did the cardboard. I'm doing a landscape again because why not? So using my ink pen, I'm pressing pretty firmly to draw into my plate. Now, if I were doing this with my students in my classroom, usually what we will do is draw our designs on a piece of copy paper first. Copy paper is nice and thin, and it also allows them to erase and change their drawing as they go, as opposed to drawing it on styrofoam and then being locked into place with their idea. Especially if they're not happy with it, they'll want to be able to change. Once they have drawn it on copy paper with a pencil, we tape that paper to their styrofoam surface, whether it be a circle or a rectangle of styrofoam. Then they use an ink pen to trace their entire drawing. It usually slices right through the copy paper, but what it does is it makes it so whatever they had on that copy paper now appears on their plate. They peel off that copy paper, trace over their drawing again, this time using a different color pen. So what's the deal with the 2 different color pens? Your students need to trace over their ink pen lines not once but twice to really incise them or make them deep enough. And if your students are like mine, they like to avoid work at all costs and try to pull a fast one. But we're too smart for that. So that's why I first give them a blue pen to draw with. Then they share it with me, and then I trade them for a black pen. This ensures that they've not only traced it twice, but I can tell at a glance that they've traced it twice because now the whole thing is covered in black. Okay, so here I am tracing over my drawings twice. Now I'm ready to do the marker trick again. What do you know? It's the same kind of concept, except this time, instead of doing it on foil, I am doing it on my styrofoam plate. So if you're in the classroom, as you probably know, you can print on these styrofoam plates with a brayer of ink. I get a lot of questions, though, about where can you buy these styrofoam, not the styrofoam plates, because you guys know the grocery store, but where can you buy what's called quote-unquote scratch foam? Scratch foam is the name brand of printing plate foam. It's basically styrofoam, or it is styrofoam, that you can buy pre-cut in a variety of sizes in any of your art supply catalogs. It's called scratch foam. I usually buy the square that's about a 4x6. That would be a rectangle, Steven, it's not a square. And then my students do that trick that I mentioned where I give them a piece of copy paper that's cut to that same size, create their drawing, trace it onto that shape. But that's where you can get foam that you'll be able to have it all the same size for your students. So if you're creating art kits for your kids, you could definitely buy a bulk order of that scratch foam. That way you know for certain all of your kids are going to have styrofoam to work on. Now, once your students are back in the classroom and they have completed their printing plate, You could do the same thing that we did before with our coleograph and cover it in foil. They could also go over it with Sharpies just like this. Something that I really love to do with their printing plates, aside from the Sharpie thing and the aluminum foil trick, is to do this. I take all of their their foam printing plates outside, and I spray them all at once with a little spritz of 3M spray glue. Then I bring them back inside, and the surface of the styrofoam is all sticky and tacky. My students get their sticky foam plate back, and then they place a piece of aluminum foil on top of that. And the reason we do the glue trick is because then it will stick to the foam a lot better. You may have noticed earlier when I did it with the buildings, it kind of stuck out a little bit. It wasn't quite adhering to the surface of the plate as well. So if you hit it with a little spritz of that spray glue, it will. Once your students have massaged the styrofoam plate, then you can have them all take them outside. This is what I usually do after they're finished covering them. I usually have them bring me their plates again. I take them outside, usually during my plan time, not the kids, the styrofoam plates, and I spray paint them with very, very cheap black matte spray paint, $1 a can spray paint from Home Depot. And once I've sprayed it with that, their printing plate covered in foil is now completely black. Then they're given a little bit of steel wool, the finest of steel wool. I think it's quadruple zero steel wool, and they burnish or rub the spray paint off. This creates a really cool antiqued look to their plate. And again, one more way for you to get even more artwork out of this print. All right, so here I've almost finished coloring this in, and now speaking of prints, I'm ready to pull this one. So I'm going to go ahead and get another piece of paper nice and damp before pulling another print. So let's scoot this bad boy out of the way, get our sponge foam back out, dampen the paper, try to get the dampness correct this time before taking a chance and pulling the print. Let's see how we do. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and dampen it. And by the way, I usually in my classroom have my students just use a sponge, but I really like this foam brush with the handle that I happen to have on hand. I think I might have to get several of those for my classroom for my students to do this trick. Okay, big reveal. Cross your fingers, everybody. Let's see how it goes. Okay, not too bad. Thank you guys so much for joining me. I hope you had so much fun printing with me. I love sharing with you. Have a good one, guys.